So this is the fourth part for practical assignment 4, the last part. And I know this has been a long haul, this assignment, but we're almost done. So let me go ahead and get rid of my PowerPoint here. So now we're at the point we've created our database tables. We have our helper tables all completed. We've got everything kind of set the stage to do the actual data imports. There is a lot of data in that spreadsheet, right? It's 7,000 rows. Um, the problem is we have that data sort of splattered into all these different tables. Now, I should tell you, there is another way to do all this, right? Like we could have sometimes when you get a table like this, and let me open up the table so we can see it. Sorry, I cut my audio off too soon, but let me open up the table. So this is the table we're actually working with, right? Now, in theory, one technique that some DBAs will use to import a massive amount of data like this, and this isn't even that massive, but one way you could do this is you could just create a raw table for all of your raw data and build that database just with the raw data, just have one huge table that has everything in it. Now, the problem here is that that wouldn't work. And because this data gave us a little bit of a challenge in that there are so many columns that it exceeds the limit for the number of columns and the length of a single row. Some of these rows are beyond the limit that MySQL will support. So that's kind of a challenge for us. So that means we have to kind of piecemeal import this data, and that's why we broke it up into these little pieces. That's why this is my approach to this data set, is to break it up. The other way is pretty easy, right? If we could just import this as one giant table, then we could just do select and insert statements to move the data around into different tables, and we can use some SQL scripting, which usually comes pretty natural to most DBAs. But we're not able to do that because some of the challenges, and that's the reality, is that in many cases we have these challenges that we have to deal with. So looking at this data, we're now ready to try to import all this data. As I said before, OPID is going to be our basically the key that ties this all together, because I'm assuming that each college campus has its own OPEID. According to the data dictionary, they do. They have their own OPEID and OPEID6. They're really the same number, but it looks like they pad it with zeros if the number is not long enough for the OPID. So either way, we should be able to import all this data now. So in order to do that, we have to copy this up to your server. So just like we copied everything else, right? If we come back over to the PowerShell, right? So here's my PowerShell. There should be a CSV that we can copy up there, right? That's in your folder. So mine is called merged because I didn't change the name, right? So I'm just going to copy that merged file up. It's kind of big, so it's going to take a little bit of time for it to copy. Oh, wait, I probably didn't put the password in the right way. Let's see if hopefully I didn't fat finger it. There we go. So you can see it's kind of the percentage is taking a little longer this time. It's much bigger file. It's a couple of megabytes. All right, the file is copied. So now I've got the file up on the server. Now we can start thinking about how we're going to import this data. So let's come back over to the script that we've been building. So our next step in the script is to actually do the inserts. So let's just start putting some information in here. So the first thing that we need to do, actually, even before we do the first thing, I like to just put something in here that sort of separates these different sections. So now we're going to insert everything, right? Now, in order to do this, there's two approaches. We could build the insert statements, but these insert statements are going to be huge, right? Because they're going to have a lot of data. So instead of building the inserts, I'm going to let PHP do the inserts for us, right? So instead of outputting them to some kind of text file, I'm going to connect to the database directly from PHP. Now, if you're using Perl or Python or JavaScript or C or C++, I don't care what you're using, all these different programming languages, you can connect to the database and just pass insert statements. So it's, and even if you're just using, the shell, right? If you're just doing shell scripting, you could do this from shell scripting as well, right? You can connect to MySQL from a shell script and do all of this work. So lots of different ways to do this. But in any event, here we have my server name. There's my username, my password in plain text for my server. That's not my password for my actual machine, right? That's just my database password. And then we have our database name and so forth, right? So it's all in here. So if it's able to connect, it's going to say connected successfully, right? So we know we connected to the database. If it can't connect, it's going to give a failure and tell us why it didn't connect. So just, some very simple code here to connect to our database. Now that we're connected to the database, now we can start. Now, of course, the first step is we have to open our file, right? So we have to go find that file. Mine is PA4.1. Right? And then once we open that file, or I'm sorry, once we get that file, we have to, we have to know where that file is. Then I'm going to open it. So I'm not going to create a, I'm not going to treat it as an array this time. I'm going to kind of do this work myself because um, it's such a huge. Here's the problem: is that because there's so many columns and it makes the array so large, it's going to exceed the size limit in PHP for a single data structure, right? PHP is not a database engine. It doesn't know how to deal with huge data structures like a database engine does, which is why we use a database, right? Otherwise, we could just have text files laying around and we could, do all kinds of stuff. We talked about that in class, actually. So in any event, first thing I want to do is I want to keep track of my inserts. I want to keep track if they failed or if they were successful so that I can output that and I can track this somehow. My next step is I want to check to make sure that I was able to open the file. So if I was able to successfully open the file, I'm going to set a counter to 0 because I'm going to try to keep count of all these inserts that we're doing, right? Among other things. So first step is once I have my counter. So while I have a line in my file, so I'm going to read each line one at a time inside a while loop. Okay. The other thing is, just in case I screw up, because I have a tendency to do that, if n is greater than some ridiculously huge number, meaning that I've tried to insert 9,999,000 records, I know I probably have an endless loop, and I should probably break, right? I don't want it to just run forever. So that's my first step. Now, my next step is the first line of that CSV, right? So the very first line. So I want to check to see if I'm in the first line. So if I'm at record 0, right? I'm at the first iteration in this file. Then that means that I must be looking at the header. So that means I need to create an array of the header of my CSV. That way I know what all my column names are. Once I do that, right, now I can work with those. So my next step, I'm going to copy and paste this for you. So my next step is if it's not the first line. So if it's 0, that means it's the first line. Otherwise, if it's not, I'm going to, whatever line I'm on, I'm going to explode it, and I'm going to mash it together with this header, right? So that's what this is doing down here, is it's creating a row that's an associative array by mashing the header with the columns. So it's going to kind of just jam them together so I know which column belongs to which data in my row, so I can reference it by name, right? So I know what the names of all of these different values are. All right, next, once I have all that figured out, right, I've created these rows. My next step is a little for loop that's going to go through my tables. I still have these tables, right? So let me copy and paste this for you. All right, so for each table, right? So for each table that I have, I'm going to have my table and my columns. This looks very familiar. I did this before. If the table name's not blank and it's not completion, just like before, I'm going to start to generate my insert statement. So insert into whatever the table name is, right? So I'm basically getting my list of tables, right? I already have my table list. We already created that in this script, earlier in the script. So I already have this huge list of tables in an array. I'm going to iterate through this. So that has my column names and my table names. So I'm going to use that to generate, that's my source of truth, right? That has the real table name I created and all the column names that I care about. So I'm going to go in, get that list of table names, and I'm going to generate the insert statement just like I did before. So I got my column list, my value list, only this time, right? It's a little bit different. This time, the values that I build, right, are going to be based on what's in my CSV. So first I'm going to take, by the way, I'm trimming because I don't trust this data, right? If there's any white space before or after the column name or before or after a value, I want to make sure. So here I'm checking to make sure that the column name isn't blank, that it's not OPEID, because I'm already handling the OPEID separately. So I don't want to insert those twice. Um, so as long as it's not blank or OPEID, then my columns list is going to contain the column name, right? And then if my column is either null, right? If in my, that CSV that we got from data.gov, if it's either null or privacy suppressed, which means there's no valid data, right? I don't really care. Or if it's just blank, right? They didn't put anything in there. If that column's null, privacy suppressed, or blank, I'm going to set it to null, because in any one of those three cases, I just want it to be null. Otherwise, if it's an integer, I'm going to build, or it's a float, right? So if it's a float or an integer, I don't put single quotes. I'm also going to check to make sure it's actually a number, right? Because if it's a data type of integer and float and it's not actually a number, I don't want to insert anything, right? I'm going to skip it. So that's so I'm just going to create that next record with a comma at the end, and that's going to be a value. Otherwise, if it's not numeric, I'm going to make it null, right? That way I'm not skipping a column. So if it's not numeric, so again, I'm checking to see if they said it's null or if it's got a weird value in it. If it's an integer or a float, and it's numeric, it's going to get the value. Otherwise, it's going to be null. Otherwise, if it's something else, then I know it's just going to be a string. So I just surround it with single quotes. This is the MySQLi real escape string is a function in PHP that's going to automatically get rid of anything that's going to break the insert statement. So single quotes, things like that. So that's going to get rid of that sort of thing. All right. So once that's done, I do have to add that OPEID, right? So the OPEID. Let's come back. There we go. So our OPEID, so I'm going to add the OPEID to my columns list and the value of OPEID from my row. OPEID is always going to be there, right? Because I'm always working against this same row as I iterate through all these tables. So I've always got it available to work with it. All right, so that's going to add the OPEID. Then I'm going to build the insert statement, right? So now I've got the value, the columns list, right? So here it is. I've got my values list right here, right? So there's a columns list and a values list. I put it all together into an insert statement, which you see down here. Oops. There we go. Which you see down here. And then my next step is to actually just run the insert statement, right? So, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. So let me copy and paste again some code here. So now it's basically going to take that connection to the query and it's going to tell it to run that insert statement. And if it worked, right? So this equals true means that if that actually worked, if it was able to run that insert statement, and I'm just going to get rid of this down here because that was just some notes I was adding for myself. So if it worked, it's going to increment the inserted counter. And if it doesn't work, right, so if this is false, then it's going to output an error message. It's going to tell us that something failed, and it's also going to output the error, right? So we can see what the error was for that particular insert. And it's going to give me the insert statement, so we could do some debugging. And of course, increment the failed counter so we know that something failed, right? Once that's done, then really all we have to do is close out the rest of our script. So let me copy and paste some more code in here for you. All right, so we close all these statements. We're going to increment n, right? So here's my n where it gets set. After each iteration, it gets incremented. That way we know we're on the next row. And then down here, we're going to close that file, the handle on that file. So because we're no longer reading the file, I'm going to output how many we successfully inserted and how many were failed to be inserted. And down here, this is just a catch from, if you scroll back up, if we don't, if the file couldn't be opened, it's going to output just error. So I know that it couldn't open the file. So that's it. That is how we build this data, right, from that file. And now the trick is to see if it works, right? So we're going to come back over here. We're going to run this. All right. Oh, here we go. Oh, I forgot to change the name of the database, right? So connection failed, unknown database test, right? Didn't know what database that was. So if I come back over here, it's a scorecard, right? College underscore scorecard. And again, if you have to make that change, you're going to have to upload to the server again, right? Oh, it doesn't know what college scorecard is. Um, oh, did I make it 2 words? I might have made it 2 words. Let's see. Let me go back to. Oh yeah, no, it's it's all one word, camel case. So let's go back and fix it. Third time's a charm. And again, you would have to upload this if you're following along, writing the script. All right, now it's doing stuff. The fact that this is taking a while, right? I just got a blinking cursor, tells me there's something happening in the background, right? I don't know what it's doing in the background, but if I come over here and I'm going to select count star from root, see how many records we have in root. We have 1,592 so far. Now we have 1828, right? We know there's about 7,000 colleges in here. Each one of them is going to have a record, right? So just going to keep refreshing this. Meanwhile, over here, still running, right? Once this is done, it should tell me how many it successfully inserted, how many it failed. So I'm going to pause the video while this is running, so you don't have to stare here at it. Well, I'd say that was a success. It says it successfully inserted 64,575 rows, right, across all those different tables. So really, that one file, it was 7,000 rows because we broke it up into different tables because, we needed to for a variety of reasons, good database design, normalization, all the stuff we've talked about, turned into 64,575 inserts, right? Instead of just one giant table. But now I've got a kind of a more normalized database and we can work with that database. By the way, failed 0. So that means everything worked, right? And we can start, kind of tweaking and working with that data. So if I come back over here, my count right now, and you can see I've got 7,175 rows. Let's see if we can write an insert statement. So if we do select star from, let's see, we're going to do maybe root, right? So in root, we have some basic information, right? We have the latitude and the longitude, which is kind of interesting, I suppose. If we look at school, let's see what we have here. Right, there's the name of the institution, the OPE ID, which is important, right? Whole bunch of other information. Let's see what else. I think religious affiliation is in here somewhere, right? Oh, there it is. Yep, religious affiliation. Not all of them have one, but so we're going to do select star from school, and I'm going to join um, rel affil on the ID, right? The religious affiliation ID equals school dot religious affiliation. And all I really care about here is we want the institution name. And let's see. And the rel of fill dot value. Let's see what we get. There we go. So now I've got a nice short list of all the different universities and what their religious affiliation are, right? So this is basically a comprehensive list of probably every college and their religious affiliation. There's only 91 here, so it looks like some of them, I guess, probably don't report, right? So that's one query we can do. We can also select star from school, where institution name. Let's see if we can find Drexel on this list. Oh, it is case sensitive, right? There we go. There's Drexel University in Philadelphia. And we can look up all this other information if we wanted to. So I'd like you to turn in for this last section is these two queries. By the way, I have to put a little semicolon between the two. Execute these two queries and give me a screenshot for each one. Okay, so one for Drexel and one for all the religious affiliations. Oh, I almost forgot. What you want to do is put your name in here, right? So I'm going to put my name as me. Right, so now on my list, I've got my name, I've got the institution, and I've got the religious affiliation. So again, just take a screenshot of Workbench showing this information. If you don't have Workbench, then you can do the same thing, the same query you can do in MySQL from the SSH session. So you can do it either way, and I'll take either one. That's it. So that's all you need to do for this week. I know that probably seemed like a lot, but hopefully you're able to put this all together and get a good sense of kind of what it looks like to have to work with some data and create your database. And I think hopefully this kind of tied together what we did with our database design when we did that logical design and that physical design, and then we see kind of the reality of how this all has to come together to support that data. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.